Welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Gold, Board Chair at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you all for joining us for Building Bridges, Diverse Communities' Response to Rising Hate Crimes. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Building Bridges is a monthly discussion series that brings together leaders of community organizations for a conversation about working toward common social justice goals. Today's discussion will focus on how hate crimes are impacting all of us and how we can work together to stand up against such hate. We are delighted to welcome leaders from each of our 4 partner organizations. Rabbi Joel Simmons, Executive Director, Jewish Center for Justice, Michael Lawson, President and CEO at Los Angeles Urban League, Rosie Arroyo, Board Chair at Hispanas, Organized for Political Equality, Hope, and Nancy Yap, Executive Director at Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment Cause. The conversation will be moderated by Dan Schnur. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's discussion at no charge. So if you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org/donate, or better still, becoming a member. More information about membership and a complete list of benefits is available at holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. And now, with no further ado, it is my pleasure to formally introduce you to today's moderator, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create the Building Bridges program and for serving as moderator today for a special installment in this series. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I will say that that was the exact right amount of ado, particularly for such a critically important topic, the challenge of hate crimes that all of our communities face. And as Michelle said, we're really lucky to have with us, as always, representatives of 4 of Southern California's foremost community organizations, all of which work to confront these types of challenges every single day. What I'd like to do to start with today is to ask each of our community leaders to talk a little bit about the challenge as it exists in their own community. Because I think most of us, when we think about hate crimes, we either think understandably about those that most directly impact us and the people we care about in our own communities, and also those types of atrocities that gather so much media and public attention. And so I'm going to start with Nancy Yap, the Executive Director for CAUSE, Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. One, because Nancy's really, really smart, and because she spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, but also because, unfortunately, tragically, the Asian Pacific community has faced a rising level of public hatred over the course of the last year during the time of our pandemic. Unjustifiably, we would all agree, but in increasing numbers. And while there is still some discussion going on among the appropriate officials in Atlanta about whether the horrific crime there, in which 8 people died, 6 of Asian Pacific heritage, whether that will ultimately be classified as a hate crime or not, if nothing else, that tragedy focused our attention on the rising challenges that the AP community has been facing over the course of the last year. But of course, Nancy, this isn't just a year-long problem. It's one with much deeper roots. So maybe you can start us off by talking about this recent challenge and its roots.
Sure. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Holocaust Museum for having me here today, all of us here today for this conversation. I just feel like I'm in great company always on these panels, and I think talking about something so difficult. Our community is facing more visible, but also what's interesting for me is the lack of data around our community had made it difficult for us to capture, as well as hesitation to report. We do have an incident reporting site called Stop AAPI Hate that did track 3,800 reported incidents between March 2020 and February 2021. And so just seeing that uptick, but also the range of what hate has looked like for our community. And as you mentioned with what happened in Atlanta, but you're right, things have happened to our community for a long time. And even still, for me, someone who's been doing the work in this community, I'm still learning of things that have happened across the country to pockets of our ethnic neighborhoods throughout history, from the Chinese that were building the railroads to Japanese American internment, but also here in California, even I just learned about a mass shooting at a school with predominantly Southeast Asian students in the 80s in Stockton. And these incidents were hidden before. And I think that's what we have now is opportunities to learn that these aren't unique moments in time and that we have a lot of way to grow. But the other thing I just want to mention, because of the company I'm keeping in this panel, is we also have a history of working together across communities. We have a history of supporting one another and just reminding each other that we don't need to be pit against each other in these moments that are so difficult for our communities already. And so I just feel fortunate that we can continue this conversation together, all of us.
Nancy, thank you so much. I'd like to come next to Rabbi Joel Simons, who's the executive director, as Michelle mentioned, of Jewish Center for Justice. And Joel, if I'll share I'll admit something to you and to the rest of into our audience. As I was preparing for today's program, I went back through notes that I had made when we decided on this topic just about a month ago. And the article that I had on the top of my original to-do list to frame the conversation was from the Forward, the Jewish publication, about the increase in hate crimes in the Jewish community. Now, of course, since then, the atrocities in Atlanta and Boulder and elsewhere have largely eclipsed at least immediate public and media attention. But as I was preparing, it was a reminder to me that this is something that our Jewish community faces on a regular basis as well and has for some time too. So maybe you, as Nancy did, can talk a little bit about the current challenges the Jewish community faces in terms of an increase in hate crimes in recent years, but also the historical roots that have led to these atrocities, and something we've become all too familiar with over years, decades, and centuries.
Thank you so much. And it is such an honor to be with all of you right now. I've always been taught that in moments of difficulty, to find those pockets of light, and having this community has been that pocket of light. So these horrific crimes are committed. That is when people rush to one another. I think what has been so powerful about this series is that we came together because it was time to come together, so that when moments like this happen, we are here for one another. And I think that really has been the history of these coalitions, and hopefully that will be the future of these coalitions. I'm reminded that my children sadly do not know of a Jewish community that doesn't involve guards and checkpoints and barriers and safety drills at houses of worship and other Jewish institutions. I'm reminded in the last few years, parents and grandparents crying to us that they worked so hard and suffered so hard so that we wouldn't have to go through this. And seeing the numbers on the rise, many people ask, what has happened and why have we been here? We joke around that, you have 2 Jews and 3 opinions and that we never agree on anything. one thing that we sadly do agree on, and one thing that sadly unites us, is that we're all victims in this moment, and that we all have a story, right? We all have that incident at our congregation, on the playground. There's just that connection. It's been here since the beginning of time, and sadly it's here currently. And so really what we have to do in moments such as this is we have to remain vigilant. We have to do what is right in terms of security measures to protect ourselves and to protect the vulnerable among us. We have to share our resources with one another, and support one another, and ensure that we're here for each other, not just when something reaches, but in those days and weeks when there's nothing in the news. Because any one of us can tell you, we walk around feeling vulnerable all the time. And some days are better than other days, but this is what we have inherited. But what strengthens me is knowing that we're not alone in this process, because I think one of the things that makes hate crimes so horrific is that it strikes fear in the community, and you feel scared and you feel alone. And knowing that we are here together, it minimizes that fear and it strengthens that communal endeavor.
Joel, thank you so much. You made a couple of points in particular that I want to follow up on a little bit later. So stand warned that I'm coming back. But in the meantime, I'm also really excited and really happy that Rosie Arroyo, the chair of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, has been able to join us again. Rosie, we were so thrilled to have you the first time you're part of one of these panels, and we're really glad to have you back. But let me ask you this, as Joel and Nancy have mentioned, unfortunately, no community has a corner on having to face this type of hatred. And there's no question that the Latino community in California and elsewhere over many, many years has unfortunately far too ample experience with these types of hate crimes. Talk a little bit, we'd love to hear you talk a little bit, if you can, about how that type of animosity manifests itself on the current landscape. And once again, to provide for our audience a bit of historical perspective on where this all comes from.
Thank you, Dan. And I also just want to extend my gratitude for just all the tremendous work that has been taking place through this effort and this series of discussions. Very critical and important conversations to have, and in an important way to elevate and bring awareness, right, to these issues. And, I would just say that, and as you mentioned, and all my colleagues have also indicated, unfortunately, right, this is not the first time that we're seeing this, right? There's definitely been history, a long-standing history, right, where we've seen that communities of color have been subjected to violence, to hate crimes. And unfortunately, we're just seeing that getting worse. And many times we wonder, like, is it because social media and there is now more a magnifying glass, right, that is really showing the different levels of violence that we're seeing across communities of color. And but I would say it's definitely having a real impact in communities. Latino hate incidents increased by more than 40% between 2016 and 2018. Last year, as we might recall, there was a single gunman that killed 23 individuals in El Paso. And he picked this city because of its diversity, their rich Hispanic heritage, and close friendship with people in the nearby Ciudad Juarez. And so of what we've seen based on the hate incidents, we see that of 51 hate motivated murders that were reported in 2019, 22, almost half, were from last year's anti-Hispanic mass shooting in El Paso. Very horrific tragedy. We're seeing also how the current political and policy landscape also exacerbates these hate crimes. Just with the previous administration, there were more than 400 anti-immigrant policies that were set forth by the previous administration, directly attacking immigrant communities. And we know that Latinos also, about 34% of Latinos are immigrant. And many times people are also because of their status or just, different perceptions, stereotypes in the community, they're vulnerable. And there is a lot of fear in the community right now to even report hate crimes, to approach law enforcement, to even access public benefits, even though families have rights and should have access to these different safety net resources that they should have access to. And we know that unfortunately it's just this multi-layered effect and consequences that impact, right? And really, I would say in community, in the Latino community, there's just, sadly, it's one of those things that it many times we don't even get to see, right? Or report these different hate crimes that are happening and are invisible to an extent. And so many times community just they continue with their day to day, but are really struggling and trying to just survive and stay afloat with many of the other challenges that they're facing.
Well, Rosie, thank you very much. And I'll be eager to bring you back into the conversation in just a minute also. But let's now turn to Michael Lawson, who's the head of the LA Urban League. And Michael has been with us for almost every one of our monthly programs over 9 months now, Michael. And I feel like we discuss a common set of challenges from a different perspective each month. But this one seems particularly difficult because of the violence and the real ugliness that accompanies this expression of hatred in the form of hate crimes. Michael, you and I have talked about this before. One of my favorite books is John Meacham's The Soul of America. And he points out correctly in that book that these hatreds and these divisions have existed in this country since before we were a country. So, like the other panelists, I'm hoping, one, you will talk a bit about your perspective on this current landscape, but also offer us some historical perspective about how this has been a challenge that we have faced, so many of our communities have faced for so many years.
Thank you so much, Dan. And again, I thank you for those kind words, and thank you for inviting me again to be a part of this. From an historical perspective, you're right. This balkanization of different groups is something that this country has been based on, if you will, and even not just ethnic groups, but groups within groups, religious separations, and so on and so forth. So it's been, this pattern is not new, and it does nothing but prevent us from growing into what we could possibly be if we were to follow those wonderful words that you find in our Pledge of Allegiance and words that you'll find in the Constitution that that have always been aspirational, but not really actually exercised. The fact is that by this division keeps a particular group in power. One of the reasons why there was such pushback against the Communist Party in the 50s was because the American version of the Communist Party was bringing together disparate groups. Paul Robeson was a communist because he saw the importance of reaching out to people that didn't look like him. And I have relatives who were card-carrying members of the Communist Party, and that's what they talked about breaking down these barriers. And you look at the beginnings of the Black Panther Party, which reached out to other groups as well. It is one of these things where when you see, when the powers that be see these coalitions happening, there is tremendous pushback against it because of the power that can be created when that happens. And what I haven't mentioned in this little soliloquy is the relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community for the civil rights movement. The power of that movement was a function of the collaboration between those, the Jewish community and the Black community and other communities as well. I don't want to minimize the other religious groups and the Hispanic communities and other communities that all joined into that. And that was the power of it. That was, we made amazing strides because of those coalitions. And it is no surprise to the powers that be that they recognize that was that they couldn't combat that juggernaut. So doing anything and everything to keep these disparate groups at each other's throats is not a surprise. When you look at the prison system, which is filled with Hispanic and Black men and women, you see them, you see the tension between those two groups, and there shouldn't be tension between those two groups, but it's there. And again, that is by design. That is intentional. And it spills out into the streets in our communities. So I say this to say that when we are able to rebuild those coalitions, trust me, there will be significant pushback because of the power that we can create if we do this. And that is what the Urban League is about. That is what the NAACP is about. That is what everybody on this call is about. And we need to get that message out to members of our community so that they understand and are not misled by the echo chambers on the internet and other false statements. We are stronger together, and there is no question about it. And we have to push back against the false narrative that our enemies are the other communities of color and other communities of different religious backgrounds that we must take arms against. That is absolutely false, and it is redounding to the benefit of a growingly a small minority that is not necessarily a small minority, but the white power structure that is trying to hold on to its hold that it took by force, beginning with the decimation of the Native Americans in this country, and continued through the enslavement and the terrible treatment of the Asian population that came in and the immigrant population coming up from South America and other places. It is being done because because of the knowledge and understanding that that this coalition is strong if it comes together. And so I was appalled when I saw the number of African Americans who were doing horrible things against Asians, the Asian community, built on lies that have been perpetrated from the very beginning of this pandemic and before. The fact that we don't know about Vincent Chin, the fact that we don't, that these stories aren't told to all of our children as they grow up, so that they know that fostering these hates does nothing but limit our power. So yes, I'm proud to be a part of this, these webinars. I am honored to be a part of the Holocaust Museum's activities and to be with the other people on this panel. I apologize for speaking too long. Did I answer the first question or the second question, or did I skip them both? I forgot.
You answered them both, and let's agree this is a topic for which sound bites don't really do justice. So no worries in the slightest. A reminder to our audience is that if you have questions that you'd like me to pose to our panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to get to those questions as we move through the second half hour of our program. But we've talked about the history of these challenges. And what I'd like to do now, although some of you have already touched on them, and Joel, you certainly have, I'd like to move from the history and the challenges to potential solutions. And you did talk about a couple of things that we can do as communities going forward, but I know you've thought about this in great detail too, about more specific, tangible steps that can be taken in order to collectively confront these difficulties, these animosities.
Thank you, and I just want to say once again how wonderful and beautiful the words that everybody shared. So I think a few things. One, I'm feeling hopeful in this moment in time with the new administration, and especially with a new Department of Justice, and I think their laser focus on, after years and years of these horrific hate crimes being on the rise, really having a focus to work in communities and work with local law enforcement, work with state AGs to make sure. And I think that's an area that I think we can really put our voices and put our advocacy behind. We need to make sure that state AGs have the tools that they need, as well as feel empowered to get in front of this. We need to make sure that local law enforcement has the proper training, has the sensitivity, has the awareness to respond not only to the individual crime, but to the community after the crime. These are important. And by the way, I say this as a community that by and large has benefited from law enforcement that understands our needs. And I say this as a part of a panel in which I know law enforcement has not always understood or appreciated or responded to the needs. So when we talk about coalitions, it also means taking our relationships and using our voice with those relationships and saying the way you respond to us in our moment of need during hate crimes, you need to respond to everybody. And if you need that training, then we are going to advocate for proper funding for that training. And if you do not have the resources, well, that is why we advocate for state and national resources, like what we did 20 years ago with the Local Law Enforcement Enhancement Act, right after the horrific hate crime in Wyoming. Making sure that law enforcement knows that if they can't handle something, there are rungs to go up to get funding and training, so that no community in the aftermath of a hate crime feels even more vulnerable.
Joel, you might not have seen it, but literally seconds before you began speaking, we received a question asking what's the best way for the coalition to work with law enforcement to impact, and so very nice timing impressions on that. I should note that Police Chief Michael Moore of the LAPD has joined us for one of our first programs last summer, and we have reached out to the incoming Attorney General Rob Bonta and hope to have him with us in the future as well. But Rosie, let me turn to you now, and having taken the time to identify the scope of the challenge, what do you think of when you think of solutions, and what steps have been taken that you think can have the greatest impact if we maintain those efforts going forward?
Yes, I mean, I think, and I also see one of the comments about how Los Angeles has the opportunity to be a national leader on these issues, and I agree and believe that we should. And I think a couple of things. The first is that, there is, I feel, a lot of great collaboration, coordination happening, across, communities of color. But I think many times, sometimes we elevate more the differences and where we're falling short. I think we really need to focus on what are we doing good and where do we deepen, these efforts, the solidarity, and that we have much in common. And I think that the more, like Michael was saying, the more that we really harness that collective power, we're going to really be able to do much more, because part of the strategy to oppress and keep communities of color, in a very challenging place is by, helping to divide us. But instead, if we recognize that we actually have more in common, and that we are stronger together, like Michael was saying, I think that's powerful. So I really do think we need to talk more. The narrative needs to shift and talk more about, again, the intersection of the issues, when we stand together for one community, we stand together for all communities. We all benefit. And so I really think that's really important. The other I feel is that we need to also really fight gun violence. I mean, we just need to tackle that issue front and center, and need to hold the offenders accountable. I mean, it's just outrageous to see that there's no accountability and when this happens. And so I feel that that's really important, that we need to do. And the third is that we need to continue to invest in the community. We need to ensure that Latinos, Asian Americans, the Black community that have opportunities for economic mobility, have access to quality healthcare, that we really are able to expand access to high quality education, and really tackle racial inequity. I mean, we see that it is a systemic structural, these are systemic structural inequities that have persisted for many decades, over a century. And so I think it's really important that this is a moment to really reimagine collaboration, imagine and how we work together. And I do feel there is a racial social justice awakening that's happening in this time that we need to really also harness and seize this moment. And so there's just so much that we can build upon, and no need to reinvent the wheel. And community knows best. And it's also, how do we ensure that we are bringing community to these spaces, ensuring that, if you're in a meeting, if you're in a place where you're talking about these issues, making sure, do we have equity? Do we have the right representation? Who's missing? Who's not at the table? So I really feel that there's just many, many ways that we can continue to advance these issues forward and conversations.
Well, thank you, Rosie. Several good points and several very tangible steps to be taken going forward. One in particular that leapt out, and Michael, you mentioned this earlier too, is the importance of coalition building. And as you correctly pointed out earlier, Michael, this is something that this entire series has been devoted to, building bridges between four communities committed to many of the same goals. That said, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, it's a really long road. And on at least one of our questions, one of our audience members expressed some real frustration, saying that despite these efforts, it often seems like things are getting worse. And the question actually framed was, are bridges being built or actually being demolished by many? The answer is probably both, but if you can talk in the context of coalition building and other concrete steps to make sure that the demolition is less impactful, and that the bridges we're building can have a positive impact.
I absolutely believe that that we're building more bridges than we're knocking down. It's not a simple linear motion. It's 3 steps forward, maybe 2 steps back. But the fact of the matter is, as I mentioned earlier, there is a very conscious effort to keep us separate that we're fighting against. It is not simply internal. The powers that be, if you will, feed on our negative intersections. And we have to recognize that and come together and find ways where we can work together and simply reach out. I will say shortly after, early on, before we started doing these, I remember getting a call from a very dear friend of mine about working with the Committee of 100, which is a long-term Chinese-based organization based out of New York that wanted to work with the Urban League and on a webinar. And I started talking to some people to help me put it together. And I remember this one person said to me, "Why are we helping them?" Another African-American person who was that I was working with. And I used that as a teachable moment. I said, because this is the right thing to do. Well, we should be waiting for them to reach out to us. I said, no, that is not the way it's going to happen. That is not the way it will happen. And I am pleased to say that I was able to change that person's mindset. But what got me more than anything else was that I realized that that there were many more people with that mindset. People who are friends of mine, people who I've known for a long time, because this discussion didn't come up in conversations normally. I had no idea that this sentiment was in place. So we have to dig deep and ask the hard questions of ourselves, and make sure that that we are able to have it as a conversation. Because this is not a difficult conversation to have. This is not a difficult conversation to that the majority of the African Americans that I'm dealing with are all Christians, and if you believe in the Christian ethos, you cannot hate the other group. And even when I talk to my Muslim brothers and sisters, it doesn't take much to have that conversation and come back with the answer that we all know is the right answer. But we live in a world where you can talk into this echo chamber called the internet and only hear voices that sound like the voices that you think are the right voices that you should hear, and you're not hearing voices of reason. I think part of it is making sure that we reach out and not assume that everyone thinks the way we do, and not be afraid of having that conversation, not be afraid of demonstrating what we saw after the George Floyd murder. That was an amazing rainbow coalition of people from around the globe. And we need to build on that. So that is the basis, the source, the beginning and the end of my optimism. It is because I believe that when you talk to people and show reason, and you're willing to listen, things happen, things move. The fact is, the reason we're all on this panel is because people respect our voice, even if they disagree with it at first. And the fact is, I can say with everyone on this panel, one of the things that you do when you're in a room with that other person is you listen and you let them talk, and then you put them in the right path. And that's what we have to continue to do, because there is no question. It is very simple. We are stronger together, and we are weaker if we're separated.
Well, thank you, Michael. And once again, just as Joel answered a question from our audience on law enforcement, just as you were beginning to speak, we saw a question asking for tangible examples of this cross-community effort. And your reference to the rallies and protests of last summer, I think, is an excellent one. In addition to some of the other historical perspective you've provided. Nancy, we've heard a whole range of different solutions from the other panelists, but one we haven't talked about enough, in my opinion, is education. We have a question from one of our audience members about education as well. And I know you've thought a great deal about early intervention and how we can teach children not only the right way to approach these efforts, but warn them off of more destructive behaviors. So can you, if you wouldn't mind talking with us a little bit about an early education in intervention process and its import?
Sure. And I find myself just listening to the other three panelists, like taking notes. I'm just excited that there are so many different approaches and solutions to something that is so difficult. But also, I think what I would say around early intervention and education is that our kids are watching us. They're watching what we do, what we say. They also know when they get away with things, like why they got away with it. And I think something like kids will be kids, boys will be boys. These statements that allow for younger folk to, under the guise of not having learned yet, not being held accountable for behavior that is othering or bullying, is very dangerous to me. But I also think that part of that is also there's an accountability that isn't just punitive. It's not just about punishment. It's actually about, I think, to your point, Michael, opportunities to teach and learn. How can we share that the reason something isn't okay? How can we talk about more just why we're acting on false understandings, or maybe just from what we don't know, right? And I think that, yes, there is value to there being more diverse, and also just for me, like our communities being included in education generally, that our stories are being told and taught, because all our communities existed here, which we shared today, and the history of hate towards our communities has existed and still impacts our kids today. And so what are the ways not only that we can model what it looks like to learn to build coalitions? And I think for me, and I notice I'm doing this a lot with my nephew and niece, is sharing with them when I don't know. Oh, I don't know this. Let's learn it together. Or I know that this is wrong. Let's figure this out. Like why don't we know about these things? And just being curious with them matters, but also showing that it matters that we learn too, that we learn about what other people are going through, what other communities are facing, but also how our experiences are part of that. I will say I'm part of, we're running a program at Cal State LA right now with the Asian and Asian American Studies program. And there are a lot of, it's an all women's program. So there's a lot of Latinas in the program. And I actually asked them, what drew you to this class? And they shared that they found that this program helped them see themselves reflected in a larger story, that what was happening, the way we talked about it, the way we taught it, was really in the context of other movements and what other people of color were doing as well. And how do we start to share a more integrated, intersectional version of what is happening here historically?
Well, Nancy, I think that's a fascinating overview of a critical challenge. It's the kind of thing that could make for a full panel discussion at some month in the future, and I'm hoping that we can do it. But I also have to give you credit for your sense of self-awareness and personal security to admit to your niece and nephew that you don't know everything. I make sure my niece and nephew think that I do know everything. So I'm going to have to take a lesson from you on that one. Rosie, Nancy talked in her analysis about storytelling. And of course, one of the places that in 21st century society, we get our stories is from the media. And they help us establish a narrative, a construct for thinking and talking about these things. Would you be willing to offer some of your thoughts on the role of the media in this discussion, what they do well and what they don't do as well?
Yes. So I think it's great, right, that we now have just multiple media outlets to get news information in a very quickly and accessible manner through social media, mainstream media, right? news outlets. There's just so much. The challenge with that, right, is that as we're seeing this increased media consumption, we're also seeing that the increased role that media has had in the escalation of violence and bias against communities of color. And just like Nancy was highlighting in terms of, the importance of being able for communities to see themselves in history, be able to relate, it's the same thing with media and television, from being able, we see there are challenges that we don't see a lot of inclusion of communities of color, and when it comes to the entertainment industry. And there's also, in terms of social media, many times, again, we saw with the previous administration, there was just a very anti-immigrant rhetoric. And we saw with immigration and just how that just skyrocketed anti-hate crimes against immigrant communities. And there is this just whole misperception and narrative that sometimes is controlled by mainstream media. And so I think it's very important to ensure that, one, making sure where we're getting information and that they're trusted media sources. And two, that we're also uplifting the right narrative, right? That is really based on facts and data. And it's really helping to highlight the challenges, that communities are facing, and sometimes how many times there's a lot of just false narrative and confuses people, and it helps to spur this anti-hate sentiment. So I think media is very important, and it is an area where we need to also closely monitor and also ensure that we have equitable representation in every aspect of it. So I think media is just a huge influencer and an area that we need to continue to work on.
Well, also a topic that we could probably spend a full hour on a future panel. I think we're going to have our 2021 schedule set by the time we finish today. But Michael, you mentioned social media a couple of minutes ago as well. And what strikes me, and I'd love to hear your insights on this, is the great thing about social media is it's empowering. It gives a voice to individuals and communities that might not have had access to the mainstream media in years past. But as Rosie correctly articulated, on one hand, that's empowering. On the other hand, it gives voice to some really ugly sentiments that might not otherwise have been heard. If I live in a small town in a pre-internet era, I might harbor horrible thoughts, but I'm somewhat isolated. Online, I can find solace, I can find support, I can find all sorts of people everywhere who share those hatreds with me. And that creates a greater challenge for us. Talk, if you can, about how we can use social media as a positive tool, while also recognizing that it can present a real challenge and a real threat.
Oh, that's a big question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. The ability to limit the number of people with whom you interact to just people who believe and sound like you and look like you and act like you is, I don't know enough about social media to address that question. I don't know how you interject or force these communities to actually listen to someone that disagrees with them. Quite frankly, I would start not with social media. I accept social media as it is. But the one thing we can control is what we teach our children in school. And again, I applaud the Jewish community for insisting that the Holocaust not be forgotten. The tragedies that have befallen these other communities have been forgotten. I've talked before about Greenwood, the district in Tulsa that was decimated. It was what we call the Black Wall Street, a 3-day riot, complete with planes that were dropping gasoline bombs on the community. 300 people buried in unmarked graves, and Black people who live in Tulsa, who grew up in Tulsa, were never taught this in school. They learned about it while watching Watchmen on cable television. The misinformation about the treatment of the enslaved people from who were brought here in 1619. There are so many. I've spoken before on this program about what was called the Red Summer in 1919, when hordes of whites went through Black townships all throughout the South, decimating our communities. A fact that I did not know about until starting to read a book about this earlier this summer. Just there is something that we can control, and that is what we teach our children.
I think you make such a smart point, Michael, which is, of course, the social media discussion doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's a representative of a broader conversation, and how that conversation is shaped is going to be determined to a large degree on how we're raised. But I think you make another important point too, and that's about our own responsibility in this. I may have mentioned this to this panel and our audience in the past, but one of the last assignment I give my students every semester at SC and at Cal and at Pepperdine is on the last day of every semester, I tell them, I said, here's my last assignment for you, and I can't grade it, but it's the most important assignment I'm going to give you this semester. I said, I want every principled conservative in this class to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive in this class to read George Will or Ross Douthat or Bret Stephens once a week, not to change your mind, not even to open it, to remember that there's other valuable perspectives out there that even if you don't agree with them, that there's smart people worth listening to and learning from. Nancy, I want to come back to you because we've talked a lot about coalition building and working together between communities. But I know one of the topics that you've spent a lot of time focusing on is the question of intersectionality. Not just that we need to stand up for each other when a single community is targeted with this kind of hatred, but how that hatred can ooze and overlap between communities. What should we be thinking about on this topic as we move forward?
Sure. I think for me, and I know one of the ways this conversation came up just was in my reflection around what had happened in Atlanta and just kind of all of the pieces in Atlanta. Many of the victims were women, Asian women, but not all of them. I will admit too, the way I found out about Atlanta was actually, Joel, your email to me was the first one I got. And that's actually how I found out. And I think it's just for us all to reach out to each other and really be able to see that intersectionality of where the connection is, elevating to Rosie's point, that we do have things in common and can support each other. But then when the story came out, and to your point around media, how little they knew about the women, how there were no like in language resources or interviews done, and the fear we have of media, the way the police chief also framed it as a bad day, I think for me was an example of kids being kids, like taken to the next level. So I will say that, like, you know, we start to humanize interesting parts of the story. But for me, what was also very heartbreaking is I remember reading that one of the women who was a customer, who also was killed, her husband, they were like, he was there, but we can't find him. Only to discover he was detained as a potential perpetrator, and that's why they couldn't find him. And he was Latino, and that all of these things aren't coincidences, that they play out in a moment where our communities are in pain and fingers just start getting pointed. But for me, that it is altogether a bigger picture of how we can react in a way that addresses as many of these things as we can, and just be honest about what happened and where we could do better. And I think that to me is important.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And Joel, I'm going to ask you the last question, which is not one that I prepared, but one that came in from one of our audience members. And it's phenomenal and deserves a lot more than a 3-minute answer, but I'm going to ask you to do your best. The questioner says, what can I do as a European white person to support groups who have to deal with hate against them? And so, Joel, as a white European person, it's me speaking to another white European person, what advice would you give to our questioner who wants to stand up and make a difference?
Amazing. This is a time that goes beyond allyship. This is deep diving work. This is a time to listen and to learn and to commit ourselves to the ongoing listening and learning. You know, we see so many people who are saying, oh, there's too much change going on right now. It's too much for me. We are a community of ongoing learners. So it is listening and learning. And it's hard because, as we've all mentioned, right, social media is our opportunity to connect during this time. And yet we have to get back to nuance, right? Coalition work is working, but it's not sexy. And so it's not being reported on and no one's posting about it, right? What is sexy is the provocative thing that gets posted on social media and the community goes up in arms. We have to elevate the platforms for local leaders to raise their voices to talk about these coalitions, right? We love talking about the Berrigan brothers and William Sloane Coffin and everyone back in the day. And we don't talk about the local leaders that were on the ground that were also making the work happen. So I think in this moment in time where we read the reports that coalitions are breaking down, they're not. We're just not giving resources and platforms to the local work at hand. So my answer is listen and learn, help elevate the local voices, give them a platform.
Boy, Joel, it's funny that there's an old saying. They say you can't eliminate bad things, but you can surround them. And I think what you've just articulated there is a very practicable way of isolating those threats by coming together, not just as a community, but as a multiplicity of communities in order to confront them collectively. I think that's a perfect wrap up to an absolutely phenomenal conversation. I want to thank Michael Lawson from Urban League. I want to thank Nancy Yap from Cause, Rosie Arroyo from Hope, and Joel Simons from Jewish Center for Justice for, as always, leading us through a fascinating conversation. Thank you, all of you, so much. I want to thank our audience members for joining us today, and I want to apologize to those of you whose questions I did not have a chance to ask. I think we got to almost all of them, but for those of you who didn't ask, I hope you'll come back next month and we'll do our best to work you in then. And then, of course, as always, I want to thank our hosts from the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, Michelle Gold, Beth Kane, Safina Goldstein, and the entire team there just do such phenomenal work. And really grateful to all of you. We'll be back with our next panel on the first Wednesday of May, and we hope all of you will join us then. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and hope to see us again soon.